every single time I try to get people together, I always want people to leave learning something new, not hearing the same old thing, and actually coming away inspired, right? There is no one more inspiring than Mike, honest to God. Remove all the military stuff and all that. He's just got such a positive outlook on life with everything that's going on. Well, maybe not right now.
I wouldn't have showed up if you were going to lead up with that, but that's all right.
Yeah. But no, I mean, listen, I've always enjoyed sitting with Mike and talking just in general. So I think this would be like a really fun discussion. And I think both of us are relatively open to chatting with anyone about pretty much anything here. But, Mike's background is really, really unique. We kind of come from, it's strange, outside of Navy versus Army, very similar trajectories, coming from similar paths, right? And kind of all led to, I would say operational excellence. Mike, started as a SEAL and then, moved to what might even be a harder job, which is working at Bridgewater Capital. If anyone knows anything about Bridgewater, I don't know what's harder. And then, moving, into this world of now being CEO of VMware, which is obviously, has its own challenges at its size and scale and what it's doing. I wanted to kind of start off first question on like operationalization, right? So, Mike's got a good blog, y'all should read it about, OLG. Do you want to explain a little bit of OLG and how you think about, going back to your days in like Abu Ghraib out west to, modern day Bridgewater to VMware, how do you operationalize data to make decisions?
Well, what Matt didn't say was I spent a couple years in DC, so I know how to answer the question that I wasn't asked. In all seriousness, I just want to first start somewhere different, which is just to say congratulations for being in the chairs that each of you are in, or standing in the back. The world certainly needs more people who can drive us forward and create value, and which all comes from mission and meaning and purpose and impact. And everybody here, even though I haven't met, I don't think many of you, but you wouldn't be in the chairs you were in if you weren't incredibly impactful and capable. So my congratulations. And then on
again, inspiration. Y'all feeling good now, aren't you?
So look, I often get the like, what in the world career path? I can't figure it out. 20 years in the SEALs, director for defense policy and strategy for Bush and Obama, and financial services and technology services. Now technology on the product side, and I think through all of it, Matt hit on it. It's really operational excellence, and to me, I think about a couple different principles. It's really just clarity of vision of where you're going. And so whether you're in the SEALs or you're at VMware, it's walking in and saying, do we have absolute clarity around where we're going? Usually, let's pretend this was the C-suite of any enterprise. If I said, where are we going? You'd get, instead put it on a 3x5. It's got to be bumper sticker-ish size. You'd get 50% of the answers would be the same, 25% would start drifting, and then the last 25% would be radically different. And that last 25% is what kills you. And so really driving that convergence around the vision, the where you're going. Then next, I think about strategy. That's the how, and it's really culture that determines how you can derive and land on a strategy, and then of course it's just execution. And so whether you're in the SEALs or VMware, it is all about that kind of framework, and then thinking through all of it. It's agility and being able to pivot quickly. We're doing this massive transformation at VMware from a business model perspective, going from legacy selling perpetual licenses to SaaS, and really the most important thing is thinking about value creation. When I'm at VMware and when we're trying to sell things to people, I don't think of it like selling at all. It's really just how can we create joint value and then share the value that we create. That's the way to think about the world. And I know that Immuta does that, VMware does that. I'm sure that your organizations do it, but the organizations that do that better than others are the ones that win.
Yeah, and if you think about just kind of continuing that trend of operational excellence, I always think it starts with people. I think it's easy to like kind of skip. We always say, okay, if we buy this tech stack, magically everything gets better, right? And that's never the case. I've never seen an organization start with tech and get to success. It always starts with organizational alignment, vision around that team. When you got into VMware, how did you have to shift things around? Like, who did you have to put to report to you? How did you have to start thinking about your organizational alignment to get to where you need to be internally, let alone to your external customers?
Well, that's a great question, and it's always a journey. So it's kind of like transformation is never done. It's just like the chief compliance officer never says, "Okay, we're compliant. I don't have a job now." You know, there's always one more thing or another mountain to climb or whatever. So for us, I think really one of the big answers, there are many to that question, but one that is metaphorically represents all of them, is really the movement from the back office becoming the front office. You know, as the world becomes more experience driven and more insights driven, you know, Amazon knowing that because I bought the gray socks, I probably should match them with some red socks, you know, and how does Amazon know what my next purchase should be? You know, that's a obviously very simple question for many of you here, but the point is, how do you use the foundation that we have in order to drive the growth? Because a lot of times for us, as the back office becomes the front office, you're really looking at KPIs that all have to do with velocity and, well, a lot based on velocity and quality. And that's what we really focus on right now. And then you need the organizational alignment to do that. We're all in large, you know, in a large enterprise. My goodness, you can't have everybody report to you because all of a sudden it's like only the CEO of a company that can really you know, get something done. You have to be able to navigate across the complexity of any organization, whether you're a large bank and on the consumer side and thinking about the products that in consumer banking and say, well, hey, what does that mean for the asset management side of the house or the wealth management side of the house? And how do you connect these together? Those are the real questions that candidly, you know, as we VMware move into what we call our third act, that we're really trying to drive. For us, just our VMware Act 1 was, you know, the virtualization of the data center, and then Act 2 was really connecting to a single cloud and thinking, how do you virtualize and connect to a cloud? But for us now, really, it's our Act 3 is really about multi-cloud, and how do we become the absolute unquestionable leader in a multi-cloud architecture, and that's really does start with people and organization, like you said.
Yeah, and just I'll come back to multi-cloud because I'm interested in that, but like. When you first got there, though, it was interesting. You had the CDO reporting to you, right, in the data office. Like, when you got in, I mean, because have you ever had a CDO report to you before?
No.
And what did you have, as like a senior executive in the business, what did you have to do to be ready to kind of adopt someone like that from a policy perspective, the type of people that are hiring, budgeting? How did you have to change your frame of mind as that type of executive? Like, what was the weirdest thing you had to come into? You know?
Well, there's a lot in there. I could take that 100 different directions. What I would start with is our chief data officer and our chief information officer were two different you know, reports in my org, and that doesn't make sense. You know, how do we unify and de-silo-ize, if you will, and really create better coupling between what is you know, what is the chief information officer and architecture for the company, and because IT isn't just going to run a network. You know, for us it's a lot more than that. We have, like, for example, we have a VMware on VMware. When our salespeople are trying to tell some head of infrastructure or a CIO in a large enterprise what we are and who we are, that can go far sometimes, but sometimes it's like you just need the person who speaks the same language. And so in our CIO world, we run on all of our own products. And so talking to our head of infrastructure, connecting that person over with the head of infra at big bank or big healthcare or big pharma, whatever company XYZ, that can carry you really, really far. So aligning people who speak the same language. Now, like you allude, I didn't grow up. I've never written a line of code. I'm not a tree person. I'm a forest person. So we've got a lot of tree people in the organization. And so it takes both to win. And so understanding and having what you don't know and having the humility to say, hey, I really don't have a freaking clue. One of the things I first looked at was, okay, what's the vision for our data organization? Well, it wasn't hard to figure out that we had suboptimal master data management. We had a very legacy data foundation. It was a multi-year year plus project, but we just rolled out we're rebuilding our entire data foundation for all of VMware. and at the same time doing an ERP upgrade on top of that, and then building a custom commerce platform on top of that. So very ambitious transformation, but for us in the data aspect, we had to debate, do we continue to use SAP for master data management? Is it Informatica? Is it blah, blah, blah? And so, as you're making these platform decisions, they're like world religions sometimes, right? And so for the weirdest thing I encountered was like, I grew up arguing like what kind of boots the SEAL team should buy, and I've got like really smart people arguing about SAP versus Informatica, which I don't know enough about. And so what do you do in those situations? Well, I've run hundreds of meetings or attended hundreds of meetings in the White House Situation Room and also not known exactly what we're talking about. So it's a matter of bringing in people who can have the honest and intellectual conversation and identifying for us the attributes that are important in the decision on a master data management platform, as an example.
I think it's a good leeway to maybe a more fun topic, which is
master data management.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'll go to sleep worrying about MDM. Yeah. I think about, when I first went in the military, my first deployment, I remember I had, an 18-year-old kid from Arkansas, never left his county before. Right? And now we're giving him information about our operational environment, and someone has to now he's going to synthesize it, right? So in the military, we have these different domains by which we collect a bunch of data, right? So there's human intelligence. I go talk to someone and they give me info, right? I have to determine if it's good or not, which is usually it's not. It's not like the movies. It's usually pretty bad. And then I get SIGINT, which is, signals intelligence. You can imagine if anyone's seen Enemy of the State. It's definitely not that cool. But then you collect that data, and then you collect MASINT, so overhead imagery, all that kind of stuff, right? We fuse it together. And then we give it to a kid who's 19, 20 years old, and then they decide to make a decision on it, and then someone goes and does something about it, right? And I think a lot of times we talk about the tech, we talk about process, we talk about that, but we forget these young kids are coming into all of our companies and having to make decisions. How, in your opinion, whether it's military, whether it's commercial, who gets to make a decision on data? How do we make that decision that they get to make it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Rather than answering on the data side, we'll stay more interested. We'll talk about the SEAL side. So I spent 20 years in the SEALs, came in '93, and then retired from the SEALs in 2013. My last job was commanding officer of SEAL Team 2, where I ran all the special operations in Southeast Afghanistan. And so the decisions of what operations we went on any given night or when we dropped bombs from an aircraft was my decision. And so those are decisions you do not want to get wrong. I'm proud of the fact that we never harmed anybody that we didn't intend to harm. And so creating a decision-making system is effectively built on data. And I'm sure there's a cultural component, but let me tell you, when I'm making a decision, first of all, it's pushing it to the right part of the organization for where a decision should be made. So you see, if I try to make every decision, we're going to crumble under our own weight. That is a system that will fail. So you just have to really think about what's the system that you want. Well, I want the person who is generally the closest to the problem and with the most experience to be making the decision. Sometimes that's me, but more often than not, it's not me. And so how do we push that to the right spot and then have that trust and confidence that the person's going to make the right decision? Now, in this situation, making a decision to the intelligence like Matt referred to, it's in the field, I've got some key leader who understands the decision-making process, but I might have information that he doesn't have. And so how do we fuse that together? The number of times we went on a mission that I'll say, 2008 or something in Iraq, and to say, we've been here for years and years. What else has happened in this square kilometer or this square 10 kilometers of Fallujah? And I don't have any of that history because at that point we were so data immature, and it was very, very frustrating. There were companies that were starting to try to solve that problem, like Palantir. That's one of the ways they got their start. But net, who has access to data? We try to democratize data as much as we can, and just recognize that it's really whether it's the operational outcome in the SEALs or the business outcome. That's really where the value is created. So that's what we really tried to focus on was the reason we were doing an operation or the business value we were trying to derive, and not get so hung up on the technology that we don't first look at the business value.
Yeah, and I think when I think I was in Baghdad in 2008, and I a lot of what was happening there reminds me of today, right? I think we were way ahead of our time back then, mostly because at that time what we were doing was putting sensors on everything to collect everything, but we didn't really know what we were going to do with it. We kind of did, right? We had algorithms that were starting to process the data and do things with it, and so we had kind of like little, I don't know, I would call it like small little wins, right, with data, but we didn't have large scale integrated wins, right? We weren't making major decisions across 100,000 soldiers in the field, right? There was 10 soldiers doing something. And I kind of feels like that's where we are today right now with our cloud journey is we've got some little wins, but we're not seeing large scale enterprise wins yet. And I think that's happening. But I think what I saw there, and I don't know if you agree, is I think it was easy for, at least for me, at like a squadron down, so squadron being like no more than 500 people, and many times in my organization much smaller. But like small organizations could leverage data quickly at that large collection, but large organizations couldn't they couldn't integrate it all well because we weren't built to do it. I think the most important thing we learned out of that was we had to break down these kind of artificial silos. Like give you an example, like I only focused on what we call a LU, line of operation, Al-Qaeda, LU, on the northern end of Baghdad, which made no sense, by the way. I argued that for a very long time because do you think that person wouldn't go to southern Baghdad to go get tea? But that organization that held the southern LU, we didn't even know each other at times. And so our data was literally sitting on physical hard drives where I'd have to give them a call and see if they had some data on this person. And I kind of feel like that's modern business right now. It's not that we're like literally calling each other, but I feel like we're still organized to be silos. And I think it's because data is powerful. That's how you get budget. And so you create fiefdoms out of it, just like we did over there, is we had our own little fiefdom. And I don't see them breaking down fast enough. And I think that's why I don't know, at VMware, there's a question actually. At VMware, at the board level, are they having conversations about leveraging all the data that you have to like converge and make teams work together globally or not?
The literal question, I don't think that's quite a board conversation, but I'm certainly talking about that. Which is why we wanted to unify our data foundation and in order to be able to get more out of it. For us, just think about any company creating a propensity to buy model. Like we have 6,000-ish sales team members in VMware, 40,000 employees, about 6,000 are salespeople. If I can every time I save 1 day of work for 6,000 people, that adds 2.4 million to our top line. There's some sensitivity things you can play with. Call it between $2 and $3 million bucks. And so if I can be faster across 6,000 people, then that's real top line growth. If I can give that salesperson more information to say call on customer X instead of customer Y, that's real helpful information. And that's why like we hear a lot about PLG, product-led growth in the world. Well, of course, as a COO, I'm trying to make OLG really the buzzword, because PLG is like it's necessary but insufficient. And so for me, what I think about operations-led growth isn't just the classic like go take cost out of a business and save some costs and redeploy it elsewhere. Sure, that's good, but also necessary and insufficient. The real next ridge line in and around operations, which I'd include data and operations, is being able to take your data and turn it into models that actually meaningfully change your top line revenue.
Switch, because we got 10 minutes here. I want to talk a little bit about Russia. I think you and I both have a good amount of foreign policy experience, and I don't know. I think this is an existential issue, so I've totally removed tech out of it and talk about this. My 2 cents, I'd like your take, is I think we're seeing kind of a modern line of technologies about to be leveraged as the core weapon in modern warfare. I think we're gonna, for those who don't know, a bunch of drones were leveraged, predominantly Iranian drones, were leveraged by Russia to attack civilian targets in Kiev, right? And it's not a direct attack necessarily, right? It was designed as a scorched earth policy. They want to slow everything down in the war because they can't get, logistics to the Russian front line. So they need to slow it down till winter because you can't move artillery and tanks and everything in winter. So it slows everything down. They can figure it out from there. But it's two things happen that I think are really important, and like your opinion is, one is it was the first time ever that that I know of anyway, where an adversary in a high intensity conflict, meaning a state-on-state actor, leveraged drones with munitions to attack a target. So that changes things quite a bit, right? We've thought about it, but we've never really seen robotics used to attack outside of like drone operations. But even then, we have operators on those. The second thing that's happened, in my opinion, is those drones didn't come from that state actor. It was another party that gave it to them. And so now the question is like existentially, did Iran violate UN treaties? Did they enter the war by giving them those materials? And how do we react to that, right? Knowing full well that while I don't think nuclear materials would necessarily be leveraged in an attack, this is a pretty nasty situation, that aligns to like Guantanamo Bay. I don't know what your thoughts are as like a former commander, but like my opinion is I think Iran definitely violated UN treaties. I think the use of any electronics and robotics given to an adversary is an act of war. And I think the United States and I think NATO are going to have to take action. And because I don't think we have a choice, because it's a slippery slope. What's next? I don't know what your thoughts are there, but I think
it's certainly a complicated topic. It's a fastball that I didn't see coming, but this is what makes it all fun, right?
Yeah.
Look, I think you need to start with the just war theory. Go back to like Augustinian just war theory, and there are several components of that. But first of all, the first question is the cause just? And I think it's not hard to figure out that the answer to that is no. So, do we actually have a just war here? No. And then there's another concept of proportionality. And certainly, raising the nuclear option, is that a fair and necessary proportional response? It's a hypothetical question right now, but absolutely not. And so I think that if one subscribes to the fact that this whole thing is not even just and needed and necessary, then where does that lead you? Setting aside the technology transfer issues that you just spoke about, I think the important thing to recognize for U.S. and NATO and those on the correct side of this activity, both from a military and an economic perspective around the globe, is to recognize that the organizations, the countries, the actors who have the most information will win. And so it does tie back to data. What's actually happening on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also by extension in other places that are arming, sending drones into Iran into Ukraine is a great example. So my personal view is that we need to do everything we can, both hard power, soft power, that will keep an unjust war from happening. Now, that said, I think you also need to think about the larger ramifications of U.S. involvement and whatnot. I think it's like you said, it's an incredibly slippery slope, and if we're not careful, then we actually can make things net worse rather than net better.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I constantly think about the use of technology in warfare, kind of going back to my times there, and I really do worry that it's usually the Americans that inject it. This is kind of a rarity where we didn't start the injection of technology into warfare, but rather it's a third party doing it. And it's kind of interesting taking a different look and seeing how it's being leveraged. And as you said, though, it's clearly unjust.